Okay. So this is our program for the week of March 10th, 2025. Amidst an array of MAGA-incited crises across our country, from the stripping of environmental protections to the dismantling of critical federal infrastructure for public education to the battle over the federal budget that's still raging in Congress right now, and shout out to Senate Democrats for reaching new lows. One singular act carried with it the fullest gravity of this administration's attempt to strip away all vestiges of democracy and accelerate the U.S. descent into fascist and autocratic rule. On Saturday, after returning from an iftar dinner, Columbia grad student Mahmoud Khalil returned home with his pregnant wife only to be confronted by ICE agents who, for all intents and purposes, abducted him, a legal permanent resident without justification, and had him sent across state lines to a prison facility in Louisiana. Mahmoud is a Palestinian refugee who was raised in a refugee camp in southern Damascus and whose family was forced off their lands years ago in Tiberias. It took some time before his family and his lawyers could identify where he was being held. And now, with the help of our comrades at Center for Constitutional Rights and the CUNY Law Clear program, and shout out to those good folks at my alma mater, Mahmoud's family is fighting for his release in court and on the streets. I'm going to play a few clips from the press conference after the court hearings this week.
I will be reading a statement on behalf of Mahmoud Khalil's wife, who does not wish to be named. My husband was kidnapped from our home, and it's shameful that the United States government continues to hold him because he stood for the rights and lives of his people. I demand his immediate release and return to our family. His disappearance has devastated our lives. Every day without him is filled with uncertainty, not just for me, but for our entire family and community. Our loved ones are struggling with the pain and fear of his sudden absence. And yet, we are not alone. So many who know and love Mahmoud have come together, refusing to stay silent. Their support is a testament to his character and to the deep injustice of what is being done to him.
And that was one of the attorneys from CUNY Clear sharing some words from Mahmoud Khalil's wife. And now I'll play a clip with Bahar Azmi, one of the attorneys at Center for Constitutional Rights.
Mr. Khalil's detention has nothing to do with security. It is only about repression. The United States government has taken the position that it can arrest, detain, and seek to deport a lawful permanent resident exclusively because of his peaceful, constitutionally protected activism. In this case, activism in support of Palestinian human rights and an end to the genocide in Gaza. The government takes the position that because the Secretary of State finds his dissent unacceptable or contrary to U.S. foreign policy, he can be deported. As Ramzi suggested, it's largely unprecedented, save for ugly historical precedents, including in the Red Scare and McCarthyism. That's what we're talking about. We're also talking about a period of repression that the Center for Constitutional Rights knows well, following 9/11, when we were in the courts trying to get people out of secret detention. One thing that's different now is the legal infrastructure is so much stronger, and everyone out here on the streets knows that we cannot hide in the face of this amount of repression. We will be fighting in the courts and fighting in the streets to bring Mahmoud home and prevent this level of repression from spreading to many others, as the administration has threatened to do.
Again, that was Bahar Azmi from the Center for Constitutional Rights. What's happening at Columbia University is a shameful extension of the university's complicity in repressing free speech, which I think all of us are familiar with from the protests on campus last year. Prior to Mahmoud's arrest, the university had already begun secret investigations into students for pro-Palestinian activity on campus, including engaging in public protests or sharing material that characterizes Israel's actions as genocide or apartheid, or even calls for halting U.S. arms sales to Israel. As Murtaza Hussein reported in this drop site news article and is quoted by Amy Greer, one of the lawyers who's working with Mahmoud and other students facing disciplinary proceedings, quote, students are being pulled into these proceedings with very few due process protections and with little to no transparency. And she went on to explain that students were being asked to, quote, defend free speech like posters or stickers that say, Stop Arming Israel, or Instagram posts that call for walkouts or art exhibitions, or a communication that simply asks for a change of class time in order to attend a protest. And according to Greer, if a quote, if the students want to even see the evidence against them, they have to sign a restrictive privacy agreement, and the OIE has thus far been unwilling to amend or alter the contract in order to make it less restrictive. Essentially, this agreement amounts to both a gag order and a contract of adhesion. Sign or lose your ability to meaningfully participate in the process. Colombia received this letter yesterday from the Trump administration via the new leadership in the US DOE, HHS, and the GSA, which is tantamount to formally written mafia shakedown. It threatens to cut off federal funding entirely unless Colombia represses free speech, including and especially a prohibition against anti-Zionism, bans on masks, and expelling or otherwise disciplining students who occupied Hind Hall. And if they could not be more explicitly white supremacist in their objectives here, it asks Colombia to place the academic departments of Middle East, South Asian, and African studies in, quote, receivership for 5 years. Worse still, as Prem Thakur from Zateo News reported, Colombia immediately ceded to some of these demands, at least with regard to punishing students who've spoken out against the genocide in Gaza, issuing news on expulsions and suspensions. This is one of innumerable red flags that we have all seen on fascism and authoritarianism being ushered in the US right now, and perhaps the one that should remind everyone of the Martin Niemöller poem, First They Came. It implicates fundamental free speech, foreign policy, racism, immigration. The administration is offering, as Bahar Azmi explained, no specific claim of illegal or criminal behavior by Mahmoud, and instead citing an obscure provision of the Immigration and Nationality Act, the INA, but from the 1952 version of that act, which was initially proposed by Democratic Senator Pat McCarran, a Red Scare era federal official who is one of the few Democrats to oppose FDR's New Deal, something that we know this administration is staunchly against, the MAGA coalition is against, and who is a known anti-Semite that opposed the efforts to bring Holocaust survivors to the U.S. So contradictions abound. And as John Gantz wrote in his new newsletter, Unpopular Front, it's now probably more appropriate to refer to the present U.S. federal government as a regime rather than as an administration. And he said, the importance and danger around Mahmoud's arrest could not be understated, saying, quote, the state cannot make it up as it goes along. It cannot seize people in the night and invent flimsy pretexts later. And if it does, then we no longer live under the rule of law. We live in a police state. Don't kid yourself. They will not stop at non-citizens. Samar, what a week. As we always say, what a week. It feels like so much of what we have been talking about last year is coming to bear in all sorts of ways. That imperial boomerang is whipping back and forth quite a bit. I'm wondering what you make of this in the context of everything that you're going to be talking about with us today.
Yeah, what a week. I like our new tagline. It's working, it's sticking. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that I was most struck by hearing what you were saying was just like, yeah, it's not going to stop with non-citizens. It's also not going to stop with the Palestine movement, right? Like these are clearly the opening salvos of a broader assault against the sort of, the vestiges of like an organized left and a sort of movement of progressive forces. So we're already seeing that put in motion. And I think one thing that always gives me pause a little bit with some of the more inflammatory language around, what an unprecedented moment this is, and it is, but not in a way that I think is a break from the sort of ongoing, U.S. imperial project, right? On the contrary, this very much feels like an acceleration rather than a break from the norm, like frankly, the Biden administration laid the groundwork for all of this to happen. And now that we're seeing where that path leads, some of them are trying to distance themselves from it. But we've been sounding the alarm on this for years now. And yeah, sure enough, here we are.
Yeah, and it's what are we in? We're in March, right? And last March we were with CCR again talking about that
Yeah.
the court cases a year ago. So anyway, great to have you back. And we're looking forward to hearing your breakdown of this case and everything that happened this week.
Thanks, Thomas. Always great to be back. So yeah, jumping right into this big week. So now that Al Jazeera is not updating its sort of casualty trackers in Gaza, I did want to just point folks to a couple of other sources that I think are useful to keep track of what's happening and where. So the two that I just wanted to uplift today, probably won't be putting these in on a weekly basis, but just to flag for you all, for folks that want a little bit more detail to dig into on their own. One is OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, does a weekly humanitarian situation update in Gaza. It's very detailed and very narrative kind of focused, but super useful to understand what's happening. And then the other, surprisingly enough, is this Wikipedia article that just lays out like updates on what's happening in Gaza. And so I just posted today's updates from that Wikipedia article, and you can see it's very detailed. It's a great sort of like bullet point analysis of who's been killed and in what context, and it also sort of extends into what Israel is doing in the West Bank. So both of those are really useful resources in the absence of the sort of tracker that we were using beforehand. But jumping into what has in fact happened this week. First, I just wanted to like spend a moment talking about what the situation is like in Gaza, where, despite the fact that this sort of phase one cessation of hostilities has broadly held, despite what Israel is doing on the borders and whatnot, it's worth noting that over the course of these few months where the ceasefire or the cessation of hostilities has held, on average, 3 people have been killed by Israeli forces per day, and that's directly being killed by the Israelis. That doesn't count an additional person per day on average being killed either by succumbing to their wounds or from unexploded ordnance. And half of all those people who have died have been in Rafah alone, just to give you a sense of the scale of devastation there and the sort of long shadow of that assault that was committed last year. So just to note that, like, even in this time of so-called peace, Israel is committing these really heinous acts. In that context, we've spoken a few times about how this pause is also when a lot of Israeli crimes are going to come to light because people are able to sort of investigate and interview people on the ground and whatnot in this period. So we're seeing, for example, just yesterday, the UN Independent International Commission of Inquiry for the Occupied Palestinian Territories, this like, UN inquiry body that's been around for quite some time now, has issued a new report about, among other things, the use of sexual and gender-based violence against Palestinians, including but not limited to forms of sexual assault, that they describe as being part of the standard operating procedures of the Israeli forces towards Palestinians. And so the idea is that these acts of sexual degradation are built in to the way that the Israeli military operates, specifically to dominate and destroy the Palestinian people, and that's in their language. So really describing the extent to which this is a sort of genocidal act, broadly designed to sort of break the back of Palestinian people. And in addition to that, we're also just want to note how little coverage this received in Western press. I feel like I saw it almost nowhere. It was in a few places, but not very many. In addition to that, the update this week as Israel sort of tries to continue tightening its grip on the Gaza Strip to force the ceasefire negotiations more towards what it wants, which is not to move into a permanent ceasefire, but to keep things in this sort of phase one liminal state where Israel can keep its troops inside Gaza and Hamas is releasing its remaining political prisoners. without Israel really committing to any sort of long-term withdrawal. So last week they cut off all aid, they shut down the borders entirely. This week they've cut off the electricity supply. And this means less than folks probably think that it does because Israel actually supplies very little electricity to Gaza, very, very little. Most of the electricity in Gaza is actually provided through generators. So there's a few things, like very specific things that Israeli electricity is providing support for. One of them is the remaining desalination plants. So that obviously is a really big deal. And cutting off electricity, that is, last week they cut off food, and this week they're cutting off water. But with the borders closed, the fuel that is needed to power those generators also isn't getting in. So in a double way, that electricity is being cut out. Um, yeah, so a lot going on with that piece. And then in the context of that, also, we're seeing stories and firsthand accounts of uh, prisoners that have experienced Israeli torture. This article in Middle East Eye goes into a lot of detail about what prisoners have experienced in Israeli prisons. It's a horrifying read, but an important one. And uh, the process of exhuming the bodies in the mass graves around Al Shifa Hospital, or really the rubble that once was Al Shifa Hospital, um, is sort of really starting to kick up this week. They've managed to exhume almost 50 bodies, I think, 48 or so, out of these mass graves, some of them being sent for like forensic investigation and others being returned to their families and others just trying to identify the bodies. And that's, 48 bodies exhumed. And the expectation of the people doing this rescue work is that 160 or some odd people remain buried in these mass graves that Israel has dumped those bodies into by al-Shifa. So that's like what's happening in the Gaza Strip right now. Behind that, there is the ongoing negotiations to get this agreement back on track. But in addition, and sort of separate to that, are these direct talks that's happening between the U.S. hostage envoy, Adam Bowler, I don't know how to pronounce his name, who has been infuriating the Israeli administration because of these direct talks with Hamas. And so this is not Trump's Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff. This is the hostage envoy who has a sort of global remit and has been talking directly with Hamas about the release of the 5 remaining dual citizen political prisoners that are being held in Gaza. And um, it's fascinating reading some of the stuff that's happened from here. And as we talked about before, he originally claimed that all they were discussing was the release of those 5 people. But as often is the case when direct negotiations happen, like more things have sort of come out of that whole process. Israel has on multiple occasions tried to stop those direct negotiations from happening, originally leaking it to the press, as we talked about last week, and since then trying to apply some political pressure here and there. But the response of the hostage envoy was fascinating, basically saying the U.S. has interests that are separate from Israel's. Not a thing I've heard from an administrative official in a very long time. And even, in this Wall Street Journal article, you can see here that after Ron Dermer, this like longstanding Israeli ambassador, uh, expressed concerns, Adam Baylor responds by saying um, that he's been having meetings with Hamas and like people need to get away from the idea that they have horns growing out of their heads and they're actually, quote, pretty nice guys. And then added that the US has its own interest to pursue and he's trying to understand Hamas's end goal. And he says, I understand the concern, but at the same time, we're the United States. We're not an agent of Israel. We have our own interests at play. And again, not a thing I've heard from an administration official in a very, very long time. I wouldn't overstate the importance of this, but through these direct talks, Hamas has basically come out with a offer of a somewhere between a 5 to 10 year truce, within which it basically said, okay, we'll release all our political prisoners in exchange for all Palestinian political prisoners to be released. We'll lay down all of our arms and allow in the US and other international inspectors to destroy the tunnel system that exists in Gaza and will entirely withdraw from politics. And you would think that that would be a thing that would be greeted, like as a, okay, well, that accomplishes, the stated objectives of the United States and in many ways Israel. But no, Israel freaked out over this and has done everything it can to force that back in, including Steve Witkoff, the Middle East envoy, basically rejecting that offer outright. Um, you know, basically condemning Hamas for speaking publicly, saying like, oh, they're making these public statements, but that actually undermines the process. And there's a few different things going on here. I think Witkoff is not a fan of these bilateral talks that are happening without him. He's using the sort of formal channels of, he's got to talk to the Qataris, and then the Qataris have to talk to Hamas, and like this like long chain of whatever, mediated through Israel. Um, so this like ceasefire negotiation process is happening basically entirely separate from those direct talks. And it's not super clear which one is really going to play out, but I think there's more institutional momentum behind this one. And again, despite the fact that Hamas has made those offers, they don't really align, I think, with what Israel and the United States actually want, as opposed to what their sort of stated aims. So this like formal process, I think, is more likely to be the one that produces an actual outcome. And the outcome that it's looking like it's heading towards right now is a sort of um, a slight deviation from the plan that we discussed last week, which is an extension of phase one of the agreement through Ramadan and Passover, which takes it through mid-April, in exchange for a number of prisoner releases. Uh, and last week, Hamas rejected that plan because it required them to release half of the remaining prisoners before the like right at the beginning of the deal. But the negotiations have clearly been ongoing about the number of people that need to be released. I think it's now down to five, if I'm not mistaken. And I'm not sure if that's five living political prisoners, but it's something around that. And that's looking much more likely. So it is possible that there will be that extension, and that extension is coming soonish. Again, I think there is interest across the board to not return to like hot war during the Ramadan and during Passover by all sides. So I think that's possible. And I do want to note something here because a few people asked me about it after last week's PSA, where I talked about the return to hot war, and I kept referring to war as opposed to the word genocide. And I want to be very clear, in case it's not obvious for folks who are attending these PSAs, that of course what Israel is doing here is a genocide. And like in my attempt to sort of what Israel is doing right now with the blockade is genocide. And I'm trying to differentiate between this stage of what Israel is doing, which is genocide, and the sort of like, return to direct armed conflict stage of the genocide, which is why I'm referring to it as war and not as genocide, even though all of it is, of course, definitely genocide. Anyway, that's where the ceasefire seems to be at this moment. I think we'll know more in probably a week or less about whether or not that new agreement can actually move forward. In terms of the long-term reconstruction plans, a series of European states have now publicly backed the Arab League plan that the US and Israel have already rejected. But again, I think we need to see this as negotiating tactics. So, it's building up the legitimacy of that plan and undermining Trump's Riviera plan. And you can already see him starting to walk it back a little bit, saying, in an interview just a couple of days ago, saying, no, look, we're not actually expelling any Palestinians. And Trump saying something like, oh, the thing that I said was just an idea, and I'm going to sit back and see if people take it or not. And that's obviously him walking back his claims because they're not gaining the kind of traction that he wanted them to gain. So again, it just goes to show that the popular resistance to these things really does have an impact in the trajectory of how some of these things move forward. Though it's really important, I think, to note that Trump basically walking these statements back, was greeted by a series of statements by Hamas and the Arab League and others basically saying like, oh, thank you, we welcome Trump, realizing that the Riviera plan's not going to happen. But like, that's overstating it. I don't think he's giving up on it. He's just hedging in case it fails. And one thing that came out in the news this week that I did not include in the slides is that the US and Israel have been holding direct talks with Sudan, Somalia, and Somaliland about them taking Palestinian refugees out of Gaza. So they're still clearly trying. It seems like they're failing. Sudan put out a statement saying like, yeah, the United States talked to us about this, but we'll never agree to it. Somalia and Somaliland both said we have no idea what you're talking about, but who knows what that actually means. Moving on to the West Bank, a really interesting article in the New York Times about the increasing pressure on the Trump administration to back West Bank annexation. Like this group of evangelicals, many of whom people of color, which is horrifying, uh, traveled to Jerusalem basically to like show their support for the plan of annexing the West Bank. One of them said, in the article something along the lines of, "I feel like God is giving Israel a blank check," which like, no, honey, that's not God. That's the United States. It's the United States that's giving them a blank check. And if they didn't, like, this wouldn't be happening. Um, but that plan for broader annexation does seem to be moving forward really meaningfully, right? And we're now in a situation where over 40,000 Palestinians in the West Bank have been displaced. And there's really no indication of whether or not they're going to be able to return home soon or ever. The violence is continuing, with like aerial bombardments, tank assaults, targeted assassinations, basically the full Gaza playbook on display in the West Bank. And that's a horrifying development that, we're seeing escalate over time. Moving out of Palestine to its environs, we haven't talked about Yemen for a long time, but here we are with the Houthis now saying that the blockade is back on because the ceasefire, they stopped when the agreement was signed, and now that the agreement is sort of dead, the blockade is back and apparently more effective than it ever was. This New York Times article about the Houthis' new drone capabilities is absolutely wild. Apparently, their old drones um, had like a range of 750 miles, which is already a lot, and they were gas powered. But they're now using hydrogen fuel cells that increase the range by like a factor of three and make them more or less impossible to detect. So, this whole giant US coordinated international campaign to stop Houthis from blocking shipping has clearly backfired spectacularly. They're apparently now better at it than they ever were. So, it'll be interesting to see what happens to that and how it impacts global trade, particularly with this sort of looming Trump session. In Lebanon, talks are now underway to not only figure out the sort of status of the remaining Israeli soldiers that are posted inside Lebanon in violation of that ceasefire agreement, but also to finalize the border between those two countries, which is like a big first step towards normalization. There's this area called the Sheba Farms, which is this disputed land that Israel occupies that Lebanon claims belongs to them. Um, and so ending territorial disputes, I think, is the sort of like Israeli strategy of undercutting the Hezbollah narrative about like we have to resist the Israeli occupation of Lebanese lands. Um, it seems a little unlikely to me, frankly, that Israel, which is currently gobbling up land from all of its neighbors, is going to, magnanimously give it all back. So I can't imagine that these negotiations are actually going to result in like clarity on the territorial distinctions between the countries in a way that the Lebanese people will find satisfactory. So it's clear that Israel wants normalization with Lebanon. They're talking about it directly as that, but whether or not they can actually accomplish it through this dialogue, I think is unlikely. But they're certainly going to try. Syria all over the news this week for all the wrong reasons. I think, in all of the Mahmoud Khalil madness, we almost lost sight of the massive unrest that's happening, particularly in the coastal areas of Syria, where um, by official counts, something like 12 or 1,300 people have been killed. But from what I've heard from folks in Syria, that number is well into the thousands. A sort of spasm of sectarian violence, largely committed by security forces aligned with the new government, not the government forces themselves, but it's a little bit blurry, attacking particularly the minority Alawi community that lives in those coastal areas. in really horrific ways, like dragging them out of their homes, in the same sort of like mass graves, broad, like killing, that sort of thing, in response to a set of attacks that may have come from Assad loyalists. That's also not super duper clear. But in the context of that, there's also this, and frankly, following on the heels of that in a way that I think was done very purposefully, came this sort of new negotiated agreement between the Syrian government, the central state, and the Turkish-led forces in the northeast. Um, this like agreement on integrating that Syrian Democratic Forces, these Kurdish-led forces, into the Syrian army has been stuck for some time. So this is a breakthrough. It's less of a breakthrough than I think people think that it is, because it actually doesn't contain any details in the agreement about whether or not the SDF will continue to sort of exist as an entity within the Syrian army, or it'll be sort of disbanded and then individually people will enlist into the army. That being the main sticking point for those negotiations before. So they've sort of punted the really big political questions here in a way, because I think that they're both eager to get something signed to sort of change the narrative away from the shadow of the sectarian killings that have been plaguing Syria all week. But the main piece of Syria news that I think it's important for us to focus on is what Israel is doing in the south, where again a series of bombardments happened this week, targeting Daraa and a few other areas in the south, once again hitting military installations, but particularly air defense installations, basically making it even easier for Israel to bomb anywhere in Syria that they want. And at the same time, also sending a lot of aid and support to the southern Druze communities in Syria that border Israel, including just this week sending a massive delegation of local Druze leaders in the south into Israel to like visit Druze shrines there. So clearly it's an attempt to like play up these sectarian differences in Syria to sort of achieve its, we talked about this at length last week, Israel's long ambition of breaking Syria into a series of ethno-states. But on the domestic front, the big news of the week, of course, and the thing that I think we do need to spend a little bit of time on, and grateful to Thomas for at least setting the tone for a lot of this, is of course the arrest and potential pending deportation of Mahmoud Khalil. A lot of this has already been covered, so I don't think I have to go too deep into it, but just a few things that I feel like are important to note. One, that Mahmoud Khalil apparently turned to Columbia University directly to ask them for support the day before he was detained, basically saying that he was scared for his life and asking for university protection. And of course, that did not happen. On the contrary, it's clear that the university was cooperating with federal agents that abducted him. This article from Mint Press, I think, is a sort of shocking dive into who Mahmoud's dean is, like the dean of his program, who is a IDF intelligence officer, uh, or sorry, a former intelligence officer at the IDF, of course, and with like deep ties to the state of Israel, who until today has not actually said a word about Mahmoud Khalil, but in this intervening week, while one of her students has been, illegally detained and arrested, instead it's just inviting, like she invited Naftali Bennett, the former Israeli prime minister, to come speak at Columbia. Just horrendous, horrendous actions on behalf of the university. And it's worth noting, of course, as I'm sure folks already know, Mahmoud Khalil has not been charged with a crime. And the White House has gone out of its way, actually, to say that they are not, in fact, charging him with any crime. So he hasn't violated any laws. He's being deported using this sort of archaic, as Thomas mentioned, this archaic law that existed specifically to kick out Eastern European Jews, that allows the Secretary of State just to say, like, oh, on foreign policy grounds, this person is being deported. And the language that they use, really the like most horrifying part of this, is that he's being deported for activities that align with a foreign terrorist organization. And for all the ways that the sort of like, long shadow of the war on terror has really eroded the ways in which, the government has to justify the way that it treats people. This one is a really unprecedented move in that direction, where literally all they have to prove is that you're doing a thing that that a group that they designate as a foreign terrorist organization also wants. So if Hamas wants a ceasefire and you're advocating for a ceasefire, then your activities align with a foreign terrorist organization. And you can imagine how, if left unchecked, that is a existential threat, not only to the Palestine solidarity movement writ large in this country, but to any justice movement in this country, where literally any progressive action towards anything can be construed as aligning with some group that the United States deems to be a foreign terrorist organization. And we'll come back to that in a bit. But this interview with a DHS official talking about, the terms of Mahmoud Khalil's detention, I think is just so Orwellian in its details. Like I really recommend listening to this is an audio interview, I think on NPR. And the host just trying to get this DHS official to say anything, him saying like, oh, he committed a deportable offense. So they're like, okay, what's the deportable offense? And he just won't answer. And he's like, well, terrorist activity. They're like, okay, what was the terrorist activity? And he just won't say anything, like because he knows there's nothing to say. Like it gave me goosebumps listening to this interview, and I recommend folks give it a listen if you just want to get a sense of the extent to which we've gone down this sort of Orwellian sinkhole. This article by Spencer Ackerman, situating this detention within the sort of war on terror arc, I think is really important to understanding it in a way that, as we discussed right at the top, is not a deviation from US policy, but is its acceleration. Like this was the logical conclude. Well, it's not even the concluding point, but it's a logical like continuation of this path that the war on terror has led us on, and the inability or unwillingness of anyone in the political class to sort of stop it or recognize the problems that are coming from it. And at the same time, in the Free Press of all places, which is not a sympathetic publication, that's Barry Weiss's nightmare new media outlet, the administration basically acknowledged that this attack on Mahmoud Khalil is a blueprint for investigations against other students. So it's meant to be the first step, like in a long series of, prosecuting student movements to the extent that they can get away with. And so the extent of the response and the extent of the resistance in this moment could not be more important, right? Like this is an attack specifically designed to do two things. It's to make people too scared to go out to protest, and it's to lay the groundwork for future oppression and jailing and imprisonment of people who are standing up for things. So the way that this Mahmoud Khalil case goes, I think will set the tone for how this administration feels like it can engage with people going forward. It's also wild that they picked him as the first one, and just again goes just to speak to the sort of evil, stupid paradigm that I can never wrap my head around with the Trump administration, where like they thought they were getting somebody on expired visa, or like that was the excuse they wanted to use, and then they didn't even realize that he was a permanent resident. Like to go after a permanent resident as the first, salvo is just a wild strategic choice, but just goes to show again that as evil as these people are, they're also really dumb, and so like it should be possible to organize around them. The 14 Democrats that signed a letter calling for his release, I think is a really powerful thing, although it's, pretty depressing that it's only 14 people. Like AOC is not on there. A lot of people that you would expect to be on there aren't on there. Even though some of them have, of course, spoken out on it publicly in other fashions. The sort of mainstream Democrat narrative about this is deeply, deeply troubling. This like statement from Chuck Schumer about what happened with Mahmoud Khalil basically spends most of his post talking about how much he hates the guy. Like, it's just so clear that the mainstream Democratic position here, isn't like don't deport him. It's like provide receipts for why he should be deported. And again, Chuck Schumer and his buddies laid the groundwork for this, right? They were the ones who had been raising the specter of like rampant anti-Semitism on campuses, and these students who are out of control, and these lies, right? These unadulterated lies that led to the point where this could happen. So now they're trying to walk away from the situation that they caused and sort of create some distance here, but they're not actually helping. Like a statement like this doesn't help, you know? We need like a more full-throated condemnation of what is very obviously a huge violation of whatever norms still exist in this country. We already talked about the letter um, that the administration sent to Colombia, so I don't need to get into that. It's worth noting, of course, that the same day they then expelled some students who occupied Hinds Hall, and then suspended a series of others. Also worth noting that just a few hours ago, another Columbia student who has been protesting, affiliated with some of the Palestine solidarity work, has been detained um, and arrested for their student protesting work. ICE agents went to Columbia a couple of days ago, and they were let in by the administration to search two students' dorms. And this isn't just confined to Columbia, right? We're seeing things like this happen at universities across the country, including Yale suspending a professor from their law school because of like an AI generated news site that accused her of working with an organization that has been determined, that has been designated by the United States to be a terrorist organization. Um, and like just based on that, suspended her. And there's a lot to that story, but yeah, you can read this article, and then I'll try to throw in some other resources on that. She has responded to it quite vociferously, so I'd recommend reading her responses. And this crackdown isn't limited to university campuses, right? It's affecting the broader progressive movement, as we said that it undoubtedly would. We're seeing now investigations into Act Blue, which is like the progressive fundraising platform that even a lot of organizations in our orbit use for fundraising and donations. So it may, Republican lawmakers are calling for terror financing investigations for Act Blue. Um, and of course, the attacks onto movements outside of Palestine solidarity has started, right? And so like with the Climate Justice Alliance attacks on an environmental justice organization, because of its ties to Palestine that happened again under Biden, we're now seeing attacks on environmental justice organizations that have nothing to do with Palestine. And now, like a half dozen or so um, may be criminally charged in the very near future um, for basically, under the same sort of rubric that they're trying to establish the precedent with Mahmoud Khalil. So again, just really underlining how important it is that that attack does not successfully quelch the movement, and that like people continue to resist the underlying premises that allowed that detention and potential deportation to happen. So that brings us to the end here. Just to wrap up, Israel is continuing to ramp up its collective punishment of the Palestinian people to try to keep the truce on its own terms. Um, but it's running out of levers. It's already cut off everything there is to cut off. So we'll see what happens, in the coming weeks as negotiations are ongoing. It looks like a new ceasefire deal might be getting closer, but it's not clear whether or not this one will actually lead to a phase two, despite its claims that it should. We're sort of stuck in this perpetual cessation of hostilities, never moving into the full Israeli withdrawal. But, at some point, something's got to give. So we'll see what happens with that in the coming week. At the same time, Israel is pushing for normalization and permanent occupation in Syria and Lebanon, particularly normalization with Lebanon, and this sort of like either the occupation of southern Syria or the creation of a client state. There is resistance to both of those things happening, but it's a bit of a mixed bag right now because of the sort of broader chaos in the region. But that resistance is right now the main thing that is preventing Israel from achieving the sort of like broader regional territorial colonial acquisition. And then, of course, this Mahmoud Khalil arrest is testing the waters for a new paradigm of fascist violence. Like we are in a new stage of this acceleration right now. And so if it is not furiously resisted, the implications for our movements are just, it's impossible to overstate just how much this will affect us and our ability to do our work. So really encourage folks to do everything they can to sign the petitions, call your members of Congress, um, come out to the streets to make sure that your voice is being heard. Speaking of which, the Free Mahmoud Khalil rally is happening tomorrow. I know that the SF St. Patrick's Day Parade, which is also being done in celebration of Irish-Palestinian solidarity, is also happening tomorrow. But that's at 10:30 a.m. So I think the Mahmoud Khalil rally is happening afterwards. Hope to see you all there. And if you want to hear about other things that are happening this week, please check out the AROC calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. And for text updates, just text PSA to 833-633-0604. And check out the PAL Media Tracker for articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up at palmediatracker.com/signup. And that's the end of it. Thank you all so much.
I'm on mute. Samar, thanks for joining us again. Yeah, and just to reiterate Samar's points that I think it's we need to resist all of this this whole program of repression at every stage, and appreciate everyone who joins these calls, who is actively participating in that. And of course, like we have plenty of students in the Bay Area that we know will also need defense, as in addition to organizers and activists that have been involved. And so continuing to have each other's back and to engage in anti-repression work is critical.